Today, like I said, I'm going to mostly talk about the early to high Middle Ages. I don't know if anybody is on. I don't know if anybody is on in Facebook Live or YouTube as well. You can, of course, if you want to enter this broadcast booth with me when I do the lecture, you can. Or, of course, you can watch it later if you want, like most of you have done, I guess. So I will be posting this lecture later to my YouTube channel. So if you have any comments, questions, let me know about the lecture. If you've got an administrative question about the class, you could email me, of course, at the email address that you have overall. Right. So anyway, so we're going to, of course, continue talking about the Middle Ages, which I think from last time I had talked about. Believe I had gone into, and we were still in the Vikings. I know that for sure. So we're still talking about that. We didn't quite finish the Vikings. I was a little short on that, but I think we had kind of gone through the period of the Franks in the early Middle Ages, and I went and talked about the Viking era or Viking age that occurred. I think we were up to the point where we were talking about how the Vikings had expanded. They had gone like into like Britain, like especially like where the eastern England is, like the Danelaw area I told you about. They went into Iceland, Greenland by the 10th century. And then I told you even about Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, had even discovered part of North America where Canada is. He had the so-called Vinland. I think we talked about that already. But you can see there, Vikings went into other parts of Europe, like northern France, which they call Normandy today. And then, of course, don't forget, the Vikings also went at one point, down through the rivers, like they told you, with the long ships. They went into like the Ukraine and Eastern Russia. So they went into all those areas as well. One group that's very famous that settles in France is called the Normans. You may have heard of the Normans and all that, of course, later. These were like believed to have been Norwegian type Vikings that left Norway and they, I guess, crossed through somehow the North Sea into the English Channel. They ended up in northern France that they now call Normandy, still today in France. And they developed this kind of unique culture that was kind of a mix of French and Viking culture, which it became. It's kind of a strange thing, but that's something you start to see a lot in Europe. And of course, they even convert to being Catholic. I think by the 10th, 11th century, they become Catholic and all that. And over time, the Normans would become like this duchy that was called the Duchy of Normandy, which was actually part of the Kingdom of France. They were actually a vassal state to them. And later what happened was in the mid-11th century, the Normans, who didn't really have a kingdom or anything like that, eventually crossed the English Channel and they invaded England, the so-called Norman conquest that you probably have heard of before. And there was a man named, they call him William, the Duke of Normandy, but of course everybody now calls him William the Conqueror, as you know. And he invaded in around October of 1066. And he went on to defeat one of the last Anglo-Saxon kings. I think his name was Harold Hardrada, was his name. And he defeated him and killed him, actually, at the Battle of Hastings. And so from there, the Normans took over England, and they brought their culture over with them, which helped to kind of inject early feudalism into England. You may have heard about the Doomsday Book that was famous with William the Conqueror, William I, and all of that. And so early feudalism starts kind of developing in France and England between like the 10th and the 11th centuries at the time. You also got the Russians, like in Russia. If you think about Russia and all that, the Vikings went in there too. And they began to explore parts of like the Ukraine and Western Russia. Why did they go there? It's believed that the Vikings were trying to travel down the rivers of Russia, like the Don River, the Dnieper, the Volga River. all those rivers you probably heard of. And they were trying to either reach the Byzantine Empire, like where the Black Sea is, or maybe the Caspian Sea, and then maybe even reach into like where the Asian trade is coming from, like the Silk Road in the east, and all that. And the Vikings that went into Russia were called, they were called the Rus, R-U-S, the Rus, which the name Rus originated from the fact that the Vikings, had the long ships, right, that they showed in the video. And if you know about the Viking ships, they were known for having people rowing them, like with oars, basically. And so the Rus meant, they meant the rowers. Those are what they called the Viking people, the rowers, because they rowed the ships. And so Russia actually means the land of it really means the land of the rowers, but over time it meant the land of the Vikings. They settled there. But over time, they became a minority. The Viking people, which were actually called themselves Varangian, was the term they used. But over time, they mixed with the local populations that were living in the Ukraine in Western Russia. And these were what we call Slavs, or Slavic people. Slavs are basically these Eastern European peoples, ethnic groups that lived throughout that region. They became the majority of the people that are actually in Russia back in medieval, early modern times. Over time, what happened was I don't know if you have to know as much about this, but over time, the Vikings and the Slavs would eventually develop their own state there, which was not a kingdom, but it was more like a collection of states that were predominantly in what is the Ukraine. And Kiev became like their capital. And so oftentimes the early medieval Russian state was called the Kievan Rus, is what they dubbed it. And it was actually ruled by these princes that were either called like a grand prince or a grand duke. And the first dynasty they founded was called the Rurik dynasty, which was founded in the 9th century in the kind of like later part of the early Middle Ages. And it was actually founded by this Viking who went by the name Rurik. That's where it came from. So basically, a lot of the early rulers of Russia were descended from Vikings. And those some other ones there. Oleg was another one that came after Rurik, who was a ruler that lived in the 10th century. And then Vladimir the First, often called Vladimir the Great, he kind of lived at the turn of the 11th century, like late 10th, early 11th centuries. And Vladimir was very important. He was the one that got all the Russians to convert to Christianity. So 11th century is about when they started doing this. And what happened was the Russians were heavily influenced by the Byzantine culture, Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, which was based around the Black Sea, like I told you before. And so they adopted their religion, Orthodox Christianity or Orthodox Church. And so that became the main religion of Russia later. They even adopted like the Russian language, which is later called Cyrillic, was basically developed from the Greek language of the Byzantine Empire overall. So yeah, the Russia was heavily influenced by the Viking culture, but also by the Byzantine Empire. So a combination of really both those cultures. Of course, I talked about this already before, but yeah, the Vikings, over time would start converting to Christianity. So that's one reason why they would eventually, settle down. And you get the Viking terror that sometimes I guess they call that time period of the Viking age kind of came to an end because they went away from their pagan type cultures, more or less. And they began to merge, like the interbreed, with, I guess, the local European populations. And so you get a mix of peoples, after that. But I did tell you that all the, days of the week, like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, are all named after Viking gods. Wednesday is actually Odin Day. Thursday's Thor Day. Friday's Frey Day. Most people don't know that. Thank God it's Frey Day, isn't it today? Most people don't know about that. Named after those gods, the Vikings. And then, of course, they believe that the Viking religion did have an influence on later Christianity, like in modern times. Like the idea of Christian heaven, they think is somewhat influenced by a combination of the Viking ideas of Valhalla. I think probably the ideas of like going back to Roman times, Hades and all that. All right, so next I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about, we need to get into the High Middle Ages. So we'll talk about that next. And of course, the big thing I'm going to talk about the High Middle Ages is the Crusades that come in. The Crusades, if you study about it, which happened mostly between the late 11th century to about the 13th century, was considered one of the most famous events that happened in the central part of the Middle Ages. Were called High Middle Ages as well. And of course, that definition kind of gives you an idea of what the Crusades were all about. It was a series of religious wars, or campaigns, military campaigns, where the Catholic West tried to recapture the Middle East from Islam, or we call also. They also say, of course, the Holy Land was, the big thing that they wanted to retake, like, Jerusalem. It's one of the big things that the West wanted to take back. And Christianity thought that, Jerusalem was where Christianity kind of started, more or less. And a lot of this started because of what happened with Islam. Islam, if you know much about it, was an Islamic religion that was started by Muhammad in the 7th century. Mostly by Arabs. After Muhammad died, what happened was the religion then spread. It went from Saudi Arabia, where it started, Arabian Peninsula, and it went like westward, like into North Africa. It went eventually northward into like Spain, eventually. It also went into like where Israel, Syria is. It pushed into Turkey. Even into Eastern Europe, of course, had some as well later. Also kept going east, like into Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, even reaching as far as India, Islam at one point. And part of what led to the Crusades was that the Byzantine Empire began to decline because of the rise of Islam. They started taking their territory from them. The Byzantine Empire, their military just wasn't as good as, I think they were even struck by bad plagues. They killed off a lot of people going back to the 6th century. So that kind of helped to eventually lead to all this happening over time by about the 10th, 11th centuries. And so what happened was the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, asked the Catholic West for help to get all this land back, more or less. And there was actually a people that came into the Middle East that were very militant, that were called the Seljuk Turks, the Turks. The Turks were Caucasian type peoples, ethnic groups that originated from close to the Caspian Sea region. It would be now like close to where Central Asia is today. And they used to historically call it an area that is, they still use today the name, I believe, which is Turkestan, the Turks. So it's kind of like between, it's kind of like west of like Mongolia and China, and maybe like the Caspian Sea. That'd be kind of like in the middle of it. It's kind of like south of Russia, would be about where it would be. So they came out of that area. The Turks entered the Middle East and they adopted Islam. They became like Sunni Muslims over time. And they were very militant people, like more militant than the Arabs, because the Arabs even respected other religions like Judaism, etc. And but they were very militant. They seized a lot of the territory and wouldn't give like a lot of the Christians rights, like to have churches and all that. And so in the 1090s, there was a emperor of the Byzantine Empire named Alexius Comnenus. He asked the West for help, like military aid, to come help them fight the Turks and all that. And of course, there was a pope in the West that said, "Hey, we'll do it." Of course, which was Pope Urban II, who was pope like in the late 11th and early 12th century. And what happened was Urban started making all these passionate sermons trying to get Western Christians to, go on this campaign, to fight and retake the Holy Land and all that, and to intervene on behalf of the Byzantines. And so what happened was these Christians that went to fight in the Middle East became known as crusaders. Hence the name. The word crusader evolved from the term to take up the cross, like Jesus. And so it's like they're kind of like Jesus, but they're warriors. They're holy warriors, I think would be the term I guess you could use more or less. So that would eventually, of course, influence, the first, crusade to start, which would start in 1096. That's when they had the first crusade, 1096 to 1099, which, by the way, the first crusade was the most successful. It was there's like probably about 10 crusades that happened total. But that one was definitely the most successful one overall. And so their whole goal was to basically take back most of the Eastern Mediterranean. So it'd be like from Turkey all the way down through Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. So all that area they wanted to retake from Islam. And there were actually kind of like two crusades that kind of happened at the same time that happened in the First Crusade. They had what they call the People's Crusade, and they had one called the Prince's Crusade. So there's two of these that of course occurred. The first one was where just a bunch of people that were mostly peasants that took up the cross, like the idea because of what Pope Urban II said. And they were led by this preacher named Peter the Hermit. And so they basically started marching toward the Middle East, towards like Turkey and all that. And they were notorious, by the way. A lot of these early crusaders, they were very famous for massacring anybody that wasn't Christian. So if you were a Jew or Muslim or something else, even some kind of heretical form of Christianity, maybe Aryan Christian or something like that, they basically massacred all those people, something they're kind of famous for. They got massacred themselves. They made it to Turkey, I think that's right. The Turks killed them all. I think they killed just about all of them, something like that. They didn't make it. But the other one did, which is, of course, the Prince's Crusade. That one was a crusade that was mostly led by nobility, like mostly princes, primarily the top ones. And they were from like mostly France, I think was involved. But they had some that came out of where Normandy is, like the Normans in northern France were involved, Italians, Germans. And there was even some, I think, some from England that participated in it. They marched across Turkey. They took over like Syria. They took over Lebanon. And then lastly, they seized control of where Israel is today. It took about a month or so, but between June and July, they retook the city of Jerusalem, which fell on July 15th, you can see, 1099 is when it basically, was taken back. Now, afterwards, what happened with the First Crusade was they went and they created these states out of it. Like all the land they conquered, they created what is basically called the so-called Crusader states, is what they dubbed it later, historians. The Crusaders themselves called it something else. They called it Outremer states, which means overseas. So that's what they called them, overseas states, Outremer states, because it's overseas from like Europe primarily. And you can see that map there. It's basically from like where southern Turkey is in Syria all the way down through Lebanon and Israel. That's the bulk of where most of these states were set up. Those are the four, by the way. Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli were the four. I'll put them on the screen too for you so you can see them as well. But here's their full names. County of Edessa and the County of Tripoli. Those were states, Crusader states, that were founded by a count and ruled by a count, hence the name. Principality of Antioch was ruled by a prince, obviously. And then Kingdom of Jerusalem, of course, was ruled by a king. the only one ruled by a king. And that fourth one, of course, Kingdom of Jerusalem, was the most powerful of the different, states that were set up. And it lasted the longest of the different ones. And that one was primarily ruled by a dynasty of French nobility that created the state right after. And I think the first ruler was named Baldwin the First. He was the first king of it and all that. So yeah, that's basically the area we're talking about that they were mostly in. So southern Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and that's what it's called. Palestine would be kind of, I think it's part of like Western Jordan, I think is kind of, where it is as well overall. And I'll get to it later, but the first one up there, you see Edessa, didn't last long. It got conquered right afterwards. They have that one up there you see in the map, Principality of Armenian Cilicia. That was actually set up by Armenian Christians. They created that state because they fled, I think, eastern Turkey, close to where Georgia is and all that. They fled there because of the Turks, and they settled there where Tarsus is in that map. And that was a separate state that was there, but it wasn't set up by the Western Crusaders and all that. So it's like a fifth one, but it's not related to the Catholic West and all that. Now, also another thing that's very famous about the First Crusade, right after the First Crusade ended, let me put that back for you. But right after it ended, what happened was they set up a bunch of these medieval knights started forming afterwards. Because if you know about the First Crusade, after the First Crusade ended, all of the Crusaders, most of them, a lot of them went home. They said, hey, we're finished. We're going home, back to Europe at that point. And so they started forming these orders of knights to protect people and to protect the Holy Land. And a lot of these groups were also, these military units were kind of like shock troops in case they needed forces for, like if another Crusader war broke out and all of that. And those three right there were the most famous. The Knights Templar, usually it's called the Templars for short. Hospitallers or Knights, Hospitallers, they call them as well. Then the Teutonic Knights or Teutonic Order was another one that was well known. The one that's the first one there, of course, which is the Knights Templar, or Templars for short, was the most famous of the medieval orders that formed during the Middle Ages. They think it formed right after the First Crusade. Actually, it formed in Jerusalem. That's where they created it because that's where the original headquarters was, which actually they built their headquarters on the Temple Mount, where the old Temple of Jerusalem was. And so that's why it was called, that's why they were called the Knights of the Templar, because it's like meant the Knights of the Temple. That's what it meant. And over time, they became like real powerful. The Knights Templar, they basically, if you know about it, had a lot of money, so much money that it's believed in Europe that they were the ones that started the whole banking industry, like especially Christian lending of money and things like, you think of like maybe the Jews lending all the money like they have later, but they were known for doing this, of course. Of course, they had a lot of land, which they did as well. Of course, they were more known for their, fighting skills as medieval knights as well. And so, like I said, they were shock troops, more or less, in various, wars and crusades. And there's a lot of secrets about the Templars, which have been kind of a mystery, about them. Some people think they knew about the Holy Grail and all that, or the whereabouts of the Ark of the Covenant. They've talked a lot about that before about it, but they're not sure if that's really true about them. They are known for their symbol, which is a red cross, which they put on their uniforms or on their shields. That's where the Red Cross symbol came from. That's used today. Like the Red Cross today, you heard of that, of course, organization. And they are known for charity, giving money to charity and helping people out, pilgrims and things like that. And so that's one of their main things that they, of course, were known for. They did have some other knights that were famous too. Like they had the Knights of St. John or the Knights Hospitallers, I think they were called as well. And this was another order which was famous for aiding like pilgrims and the sick. They were the first to create what they call hospitals to treat like the sick, things like that. And they had a white cross that they had instead. So a lot of these later orders, like that one and other ones, were kind of like knockoffs of the Knights Templar. I think it was very popular, like in England, the Knights of St. John or Hospitallers. And then in Germany, they had one called the Teutonic, Knights or Teutonic Order that was well known. So I think that was a copy of the Knights Templar too, as well. And they were known for their black cross on their uniforms and on their shields. Later, the Germans in modern times took the black cross, if you know about this, and they created the so-called Iron Cross, which became a famous war medal that's well known today. All right, yeah, let me talk about what happened now after the First Crusade would occur. If you go back up here to where that map is, right here, you had a deal where there was a deal where, like, after the First Crusade ended, they had a second one, which I'll kind of briefly talk about real quick. But there was a so-called Second Crusade that occurred. And what happened was the Turks took back where Edessa is. You see at the top right in that map. That fell to the Turks. And so it brought on another crusade called the Second Crusade, which was in the mid part of the 12th century. And in this crusade, finally, the kings of Europe decided they were going to intervene. And one of the main ones that did was the King of France. Louis VII sent forces. So did the emperor or king of the Holy Roman Empire, Conrad III. He also sent troops, but they ended up getting routed. Their forces got beat bad, but they got crushed by the Turks. And so that whole area was lost afterwards. So it's mostly in Syria today, northern Syria or western Syria. And there was something weird that happened on the way. I think some of the Crusaders were actually going there to fight. It's probably why they lost. They would have had Crusaders, but some were actually going there, sailing there from England, apparently. They were going to go fight in the Second Crusade. And they stopped off in Portugal. And that's how Portugal became a state later. Most people don't know that. That's kind of a side thing that happened, in the so-called Second Crusade. That'll be later. All right, yeah, let me go ahead and move on next. I need to, of course, get into and talk about the so-called Third Crusade, which that one's pretty famous crusade. It's kind of a toss-up between, I guess, the Third Crusade, and the First Crusade. Those two are pretty famous. I think the first one was just more successful, and the third one just more famous because of all the famous people that were in that crusade. And this one was sparked by an issue that happened in the 1180s, 1187. There was a famous sultan and Islamic general named Saladin, or also called Salah ad-Din, and he basically retook Jerusalem. Jerusalem fell to, of course, Islam. And Saladin was actually the founder of a dynasty called the Ayyubid dynasty, which actually ruled over what is Egypt and Syria. Saladin was actually of Kurdish origin. He was a Kurd, the way. And anyway, his campaign, with the whole point of it, what he wanted to do was he wanted to take back all the territory that the Crusaders had, taken, especially like in where Israel and Lebanon is, and so in Syria. And so basically, that's what he, of course, attempted to do. He took back a good, like at least half of it was taken back by Saladin, including the retaking of Jerusalem. And part of why Jerusalem fell it was because of the fact that there was a famous battle that occurred, which I think that's the wrong date. I was looking at that the other day, and I don't think that's correct. I believe it's in the year 1186 is the correct date. I believe that's correct. I'm going to check on that, but I thought it was 1186 when it happened. But they had the Battle of Aten, where most of the Crusader armies, I think most, especially under the hands of the kingdom of Jerusalem was actually wiped out by Saladin and his forces. And so that eventually allowed Saladin to go and take Jerusalem. And so that became a big deal throughout Europe. Here's a picture, of course, of Saladin, who, of course, set off the Third Crusade right here. And what happened was in Europe, they became so angry about this whole issue of Saladin, retaking the Middle East, that it sparked the so-called Second Crusade. And of course, if you know about this crusade, it had a nickname. It was called the King's Crusade. And why did they call it that? They called it that because of the fact that all these different kings in Europe decided to intervene in that Third Crusade. And so England, France, and Germany, primarily those three, Germany was called later the Holy Roman Empire. All three of those states, of course, sent forces to try and, fight against Saladin to take back all those lands. These were the main kings that participated in the Third Crusade. Of course, the most famous was the first one, Richard I, known as the Lionheart of England. He was king of England for about 10 years, but most of the time he was fighting either France or fighting in the Crusades. Philip II, of course, was his rival, also known as Philip Augustus of France. He was the king of France. Him and Richard I did not like each other. They were hated to each other, and a lot of it was because Richard had land in France, and so they fought a lot in a lot of wars with each other. And then Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, also called Frederick I, he also sent forces, but he actually died before he got there. I think he drowned crossing a river or something weird. But Richard and Philip, mostly the ones that did most of the campaigning, but Richard was really the best general that really led the Crusader forces against Saladin. And over time, he actually fought Saladin to a draw and was able to retake the northern part of Israel. In fact, Richard took back the two important cities of Jaffa and Acre, which I think are kind of like port cities, which are in northern Israel today. And so, but he was not able to retake Jerusalem. That was the only thing, of course, about that. So, what's going to happen after that, which is kind of an interesting thing that occurred, which never happened before, between the Crusaders and then the Turks. They eventually decided to sue for peace. They actually signed a treaty with each other, which is interesting about that, which happened in 1192, the so-called Treaty of Jaffa. And the treaty did two things. One, it created a 3-year truce where both sides, the Christians and the Turks, decided that they would not fight for about a 3-year period at that point. And then the other thing it did was it allowed Christians to actually make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and they wouldn't be harmed, for being a different religion or whatever. And so that was something that they did with that. And so there's kind of like a short truce between both sides for a while, but eventually they go back to fighting again, later, the West and, of course, the Islam. Now, of course, like I said, and here's a map, by the way, showing you what the Crusades kind of look like after. You can see there that, they mostly got the northern part back. You can see Israel, and then they control part of Lebanon and then part of Syria. But you can see that a lot of it, like they used to have over here in the eastern part, is pretty much gone. Like anything in Syria over here, it's all shrinking, which it does over time until they basically have nothing left overall. They had some other crusades, which, of course, if you know about the later crusades, were not very successful. They're pretty bad, actually. But I'll kind of talk briefly about some of the other crusades that they had as well. They had the so-called Fourth Crusade that followed next, which went from about 1212 to 1204. This one was a kind of a disaster kind of crusade, which not only was it a failure militarily, what they want to, do, but it also was a type of failure that caused kind of a religious split in Christianity, which I'll get to in a second. And what happened was the Crusaders were supposed to attack Jerusalem, try to seize it again, because they failed last time, and they were going to attack through Egypt, because that Egypt is where the center of the Ayyubid dynasty was at the time. So they're going to kind of attack through there. However, what happened was the Crusaders couldn't do it because they were in such debt. They couldn't afford the money for the campaign. They owed a lot of people money. I think they owed money to like the Byzantines Empire. They owed money to the Italians in Italy, who were basically equipping them. And the Italians were the ones like shipping them across, like from Italy into like Greece and Turkey and all that. And so they owed a lot of money. And also the Crusaders were kind of, they felt resentful toward the Byzantine Empire because they weren't Catholic. They were Orthodox Christians. So it was something that was kind of a thorn in the side, throughout the whole Crusades and all that. And so what happened was eventually they turned on the Byzantine Empire, turned on them. And what happened was in 1204, they actually sacked Constantinople. They actually broke into it, which that was the first time anybody had broken into the city. And they sacked the whole thing in what is April of 1204. And the Pope, you know about that in the West at the time, tried to have all the Crusaders excommunicated because they had done that. I think the Patriarch in the East, the Orthodox Church, also did the same thing. He pretty much excommunicated them too, and all that. But it was too late. Apparently, this incident where they sacked Constantinople really caused a major split between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. This became known as either the East-West Schism or the Great Schism, is what they also called it as well. It was basically a permanent split that occurred between the Catholic and Orthodox churches where they would never get back again together. Because a lot of people don't understand about the Crusades. Part of why the Crusades happened was because there was this idea to try to maybe bring the churches together, because they pretty much had been splitting since the early Middle Ages. And so the idea had been that maybe they could maybe just form one church, one Christian church, but this actually did the opposite. It caused the split permanently between them. Also, by the way, some people confuse the Great Schism, the East-West Schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, with the Papal Schism, which happens a little later in the late Middle Ages. It's not the same thing. That was where they split the Catholic Church into two popes, one in France and one in Italy. That's a little later when that happened, though. Like I said, most of the Crusades were a failure. They didn't work out very well. There was one that actually did work briefly, and that was the Sixth Crusade. That was a crusade which involved the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Germany, which was Frederick II. He was the son of Frederick Barbarossa I. And he actually led an expedition where they took Jerusalem back, but it wasn't militarily done. It was done through diplomacy. And apparently there was some kind of rebellion or something that broke out in what is Egypt, where the Turks had to put it down. And so the Sultan of Egypt said, just let him have it, because they were kind of busy with that and couldn't really stop him. And so he marched in there and just took it. And the Crusaders would hold it for a few more decades after that, but later they lost it again, Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is not really in the hands of really anybody else that's not Muslim until probably the state of Israel comes along later in modern times. But the Crusades themselves, that overall, it actually did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. It weakened the Byzantine Empire in the East. It weakened Eastern Christianity. So Christianity in the East became more weaker because of it. The popes, who, by the way, in the High Middle Ages, have become so powerful that they could send people to fight in wars, they became weaker afterwards. And the thing that really comes out of the whole Crusades the most, there's really two things that really came out the most that's kind of important. One was the European states, became more powerful as secular type, rulers, like especially England, France, etc. They become real powerful, later. And something I'll get later, and like probably a third lecture later, not now, but also the Crusades. Also, they think influenced the beginning of the Renaissance. They really did, because all these merchants and cities became really wealthy because of the Crusades, and also the Asian trade that came from the East that the Crusaders discovered when they went to the Middle East. And that would actually lead to, like, Florence and other cities that would take their wealth and they would start showing it, like in patronizing artists and things like that. And that's what led to the so-called Renaissance that would modernize things in the late Middle Ages. So I'll get to that later about the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, because that's going to be a third lecture I'll have later for you. So anyway, the last thing I'm going to do today, I've got a few minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to review a little bit for you before I go with the second lecture on the Middle Ages. Later, I am going to have a third lecture on the Middle Ages, which I'm going to mostly concentrate, which will be on the later Middle Ages. I think I'm going to talk about the Mongols probably up to like the Renaissance period, which I'll have later for you in another lecture coming up. So yeah, let me go ahead and review real quick, of course, on some of the material we've already covered so far. This course with the lectures on the Middle Ages. So yeah, why is the period after the ancient times called the Middle Ages? It's a historical period that occurs between, is that word between, or in the middle, between like the fall of the Roman Empire and then the modern times that come in with the Renaissance. So it's a between age. That's why they call it medieval, which means middle age or between age. And some people use other names like the medieval dark ages is also used as well. I think the slide is not up for some reason. Let me fix that for you. There it is right there. So yeah, you got also the what are the three sub periods? Of course, the Middle Age. You got the early Middle Age, go from like 500 to about 1,000. You got the High Middle Age, 1,000 to 1,300. You got the Late Middle Age, 1,300 to 1,500s. So they're all broken down to three sub periods. What three main influences made up the mix of culture that developed in Western and Central Europe that spawned a new Europe, which became the Middle Ages? Primarily medieval Europe was a mix of mostly three things. You had, of course, the Roman culture already there. Then the Germans came in, right? Germanic culture. So you have those two things. And then, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, Catholicism. So it's mostly a mix of those things plus other culture that was there too as well, like maybe the Moorish culture in Spain, etc., and Magyars and other people that came into like Central Europe and all that, but that's mostly what it was. Who are the Franks? The Franks were Germanic peoples that settled in Gaul, which became known as France later, or Francia, and they would establish the kingdom of the Franks, which was founded at the end of after the Roman Empire fell. What was the Merovingian dynasty? Who was King Clovis I? The Merovingian dynasty was like one of the first of the two Frankish dynasties, royal dynasties that ruled over the state of the kingdom of the Franks. And it was founded by King Clovis I. He was the first king and founded the dynasty. And Clovis in this dynasty was the first Roman Catholic dynasty that you see that's founded in medieval Europe. What political figures controlled most of the power behind the king's throne eventually, the Merovingians? That was the mayor of the palace, which the Latin name was major domo. And these were royal officials. They were kind of like a cross between a shogun and a prime minister. I think some people now compare it more to like a prime minister, maybe. I think it was more like a warlord. It's kind of what they were. And Charles Martel, of course, was the most famous. His real name was Carolus Martellus, which means Charles the Hammer. What was he famous for? Well, Charles Martel was mostly a Frankish royal official like a major domo, but he was more known as a military general of theirs. He was famous for his military victories against the Moors. Who were the Moors? The Moors were Islamic peoples from North Africa, like in Morocco, that took over Spain, and they conquered the Visigoths. And what happened was eventually Charles Martel defeated them in 732. It was the Battle of Tours, which was fought in Western France. And the Battle of Tours was a very important battle because of the fact that they think it saved Roman Catholicism from maybe being taken over by Islam in the West. And they also think that it's centralized and pretty much led to why the Franks became a major power in Western Europe, because there was no rival really to stop them. What dynasty replaced the Merovingian dynasty? That was the Carolingian dynasty, which was founded by Pepin the Short, or Pepin III. He was the son of Charles Martel, which he named it after his father, from the name Carolus Magnus. Carolus. So a Carolingian dynasty. Who was Charlemagne? Carolus Magnus, or Charles the Great, which is the Latin name, of course, in the English translation there. Charlemagne was the son of Pepin III, and Charlemagne was considered to be the greatest Frankish ruler. He would later go on to rule over what they call the Carolingian Empire, which was like a empire of the Franks that they had. And it was the peak period of the Franks, like how great they were, which was kind of peaked between the 8th and 9th centuries, roughly. And what historical work written by the historian Einhard describes his reign? Einhard was a Christian monk and personal secretary to Charlemagne. He wrote a book that's called The Life of Charles or Life of Charlemagne. It's either called either one. And it kind of depicts like his reign and who Charlemagne was. It's where we get a lot of our historical information on Charlemagne, his reign, and his empire. How large was the empire of Charlemagne? Charlemagne's empire controlled most of France, but it also controlled eastern Spain, northern Germany, southern Germany, and pretty much most of Italy. So it was probably at the time larger than the Byzantine Empire. So it was pretty big. And so in 800, they think on Christmas Day, they think that Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as emperor. And so they think that by doing that, it kind of recreated this Germanic version of the Western Roman Empire. That's what it was supposed to be. But it later became known as the Carolingian Empire. So the Catholic Church helped found the Carolingian Empire by crowning him emperor. And Charlemagne was often known as either Emperor of the Romans or King of the Romans. I think was either one that he went by. But it was supposed to be this Germanic version of the Western Roman Empire, but it really wasn't. It was really this Frankish empire that was basically Catholic. That's what it really was. What later name is it dubbed, which becomes most of the region of Germany ruled by emperors? The eastern part of it breaks off and eventually becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire, which will be supposedly founded by Charlemagne. He supposedly was the first ruler of it, they claim. But it's a name that they don't start using until later in the Middle Ages. What was the result of the Treaty of Verdun, 843, created between the grandsons of Charlemagne? This was a treaty made between basically three of the sons of Louis the Pious, who were basically what would be, I guess, the grandsons of Charlemagne. And they had fought a civil war for about 3 or 4 years, from 840 to 843. What happened was they divided up Charlemagne's empire into 3 states, which were, I think I told you, Western Francia, Middle Francia, and Eastern Francia. And the western part became France, the Kingdom of France later. And the eastern part became Germany, which they later called Holy Roman Empire. And all the states between there, like Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, all that kind of in the middle. So I told you that Charlemagne was the father of Europe. That's why, because eventually his state will break up into all the states that are in mostly Western Central Europe. Who were the Vikings? I told you the Vikings were Scandinavian peoples that came out of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark primarily. Viking was more of a derogatory name that meant something like that they were bandits or pirates, which a lot of Christians kind of viewed them as. But a lot of people call them other names like the Norseman, or Norman, because they came out of Northern Europe. War longships. The longships were these Viking warships that the Scandinavian peoples built, and they were known for being swift and very fast, using like oars, of course, and also sails. I think in England they called them dragon ships, though. That's what they called them sometimes. What were some of their main gods, and what were they attributed to? Odin was the highest god, chief god of the Vikings that lived Asgard in Valhalla, and he was the god of the warriors. His son, he had two sons. He had Odin. Odin was, of course, primarily the god of like thunder, lightning, the one that was, of course, brandished a hammer. His other son was Balder, of course, who was the god of bravery. They also had two twins, I told you, named Frey and Freya. Frey was like a god of like fertility and kingship. And he had a sister named Freya, who was like an Aphrodite version type Viking goddess. Freya was like the goddess of like love, beauty, and sex and fertility. And I'll tell you about Loki. Loki was the god of mischief, luck, and fortune. They call him the trickster god. And of course, I told you the Viking gods. It's kind of where you get the days of the week from. I think I told you about that. What areas they settled? The Vikings settled pretty much in Northern Europe, like Russia, Northern France, where Normandy is. They settled in England, also Scotland, Ireland, Southern Italy too, but also Iceland, Greenland, and then also North America, they think at one point. Who was Eric the Red? Eric the Red was a late 10th century Viking that founded the Viking settlement of Greenland. He's also the one that coined the name. Leif Erikson was his son, which is what they call him, Eric's son, if you get the name. They called him the Lucky, which was a nickname. Leif the Lucky was a famous Viking explorer. He was well known for exploring, they think, the North Atlantic, and then they believe he was the one that found, they think, part of Canada in North America. So the belief about the Vikings is that they were the first Europeans to find America. This, of course, after the Indians did. Vinland was believed to be the nickname that the Vikings called that Viking settlement that was in North America, which they think was in eastern Canada. Some believe it was maybe where, I think the main theory is now, from what they got from archaeology, is that it was in Newfoundland. But some people think they may have settled at one point in Nova Scotia. There's even some speculation, maybe even like Maine. Who are the Normans? The Normans were Norwegian Vikings that settled in northern France, which they later called Normandy. And over time, they settled there like the 10th century. What happened was in the 11th century, later, one of their leaders, their ancestors, William the Duke of Normandy, he became famous for conquering England, which he would do in 1066. And so William took his army from Normandy and crossed the English Channel and defeated the last Anglo-Saxon king at the Battle of Hastings. And so you had the so-called Norman conquest, which followed. Who are the Rus? Why are they important in early Russian history? The Rus is what they called Vikings that explored Russia, maybe mostly going down the rivers of Russia. They think they came out of Sweden, I think is one theory they have. And they were called Rus, I told you, because they were famous for rowing their ships, the long ships, but they called them actually Varangian, was what they called themselves. They think the Russians, the Vikings, would eventually help create the first Russian state there, which was called the Kievan Rus, which was based in the Ukraine around what is Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine today. And the guy that founded the state was a man named Rurik, who was a Viking. He went on to found, of course, the Rurik dynasty. I told you about Vladimir. Vladimir the Great, was one of their first great leaders who eventually converted everybody to Christianity, which is Orthodox Church, of course, from the Byzantines. Then we talked about the Crusades. Obviously, we already done before, but I guess I could kind of review it real quick again for you. But yeah, the Crusades were a series of campaigns or wars where the Catholic West retook the Holy Land and the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, like from Turkey down through Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. And I told you the Pope that started the First Crusade was Urban II, which he did really from various sermons he gave in 1095, which Muslim conquerors brought on the Crusades, the Seljuk Turks, who came out of Central Asia, who were Caucasian peoples that eventually adopted Sunni Islam. What occurred in the First Crusade? I told you the First Crusade, the most successful was the Prince's Crusade, which eventually took back Jerusalem, but they, like I told you, also re-seized they took part of southern, central Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and then Israel, which Jerusalem fell in July of 1099. What kings were set up afterwards? They then created the Crusader states that they founded afterwards, which I told you were 4 of them. You got the county of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, then they have the principality of, which I'm getting those confused with that for some reason with that, but the 4 right here. Let me go back to it right here, but where are they? I guess I'm mixing those up real quick, but yeah, there they are. Kingdom of Jerusalem was the largest, of course, and most famous. Principality of Antioch, county of Edessa, and of course the county of Tripoli. The kingdom of Jerusalem, of course, that one right there was the one that was the most powerful and the one that only had a king, of course, and it also lasted the longest of the 4. I want to say in the 13th century it was around that actual state. Then I told you about the military knightly orders. I told you about the Templars. The Knights Templar was the most famous one they had, which was founded by the Kingdom of Jerusalem originally. So they had that one. That one was known for being called that because they founded on the Temple Mount. That's where they had the headquarters, of course, in Jerusalem. They were known for their Red Cross. And then you had the Knights Hospitallers, the ones that were famous for setting up hospitals to aid the sick or help pilgrims. They had a white cross. And I told you the Teutonic Knights were known for having a black cross, and they were Germanic type knights. Third Crusade, I'll tell you about that one. That one, of course, was a crusade that basically developed because of the fact that Saladin, the famous Sultan and general, who was Kurdish origins, eventually took back Jerusalem in southern Israel. And so that brought on the so-called Third Crusade, which followed from 1189 to 1192. And this crusade, what it did was a bunch of the major kings in Europe, like England, France, Germany, all sent forces, and they were directly involved in it. And of course, I told you some of the kings that were involved that were very famous were you had Richard I, the Lionheart, of England, and then of course you had also Philip II of France, and then you had also Frederick Barbarossa I of Germany as well. And the one that did the most famous, that did the best, famously was Richard I of England. He fought Saladin to a draw, retook most of the northern part of Israel, Lebanon, like Accra, I think I told you about, in Jaffa, and he even forced, of course, Saladin to a treaty, the Treaty of Jaffa, also as well. I was trying to find the other slide. I think there was one missing. I'm not sure where it is. I guess I don't think I have it. Oh yeah, there it is right here, the Fourth Crusade. Yeah, the Fourth Crusade, that crusade, of course, was a crusade which was a failed crusade where they were supposed to attack Egypt, and then take Jerusalem. But I told you how the Crusaders turned on the Byzantine Empire, and in April of 1204 they sacked Constantinople, and I told you it led to the famous Great Schism or East-West Schism, where the Catholic and Orthodox churches pretty much split permanently afterwards. It was believed to be one of the major causes of why it happened. So anyway, just kind of like, reviewing there over the material I've covered so far with the Middle Ages. I'm going to have, of course, a third lecture coming up on the late Middle Ages. And this particular lecture, I think I'm going to work on it over the weekend for you, because my plan is to go ahead and give you the last lecture early on, like Monday morning, which I think will be looks like the 23rd of November. And so you'll be able to go ahead and start working on the exam early if you want to, going into next week. Because I'm going to give you, like, I think from, looks like November 23rd to the final exam is going to be due on, looks like Thursday, December 3rd at midnight. So you have a bunch of days to actually get it done. But don't forget, you got a bunch of assignments you still got to do that you got to, finish up on. I'll keep sending, messages out about it. But the second exam is something you, of course, got to finish up on and get done before you can do the final exam and all that. And you also have that little Roman quiz you got to do, the early Roman quiz you got to do also as well, and get that out the way. So I'm going to work on a final lecture over the weekend. And that one's going to be on the late Middle Ages. I'm just going to go ahead and fill in what I got left to do for that week 7. I just didn't get to do everything I wanted this semester. I just didn't have time, I guess, the way the schedule is with Thanksgiving and all that. But I didn't get to do like Islam and fully and Byzantine Empire. But we did a bulk of a lot of material this semester, pretty much for this class. And like I said, let me know if you have any comments, questions about the lecture, or any other question about something about the class administratively that you need to know about or whatever. But I will be sending out announcements later, probably about students that are going to be exempt from the final, because some students will not have to take the final because they have an A+ grade. You have to have a 96% or around 96% or close to it to probably get that. And I might even round some up that are 95% range, which I likely will. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you all have a good weekend. But yeah, like I said, look for that next lecture coming up, because I'm going to probably have an assignment coming up, for the final exam. But yeah, book reports are due this weekend. So I want to start seeing those in the speed grader coming up. And that's it. So y'all take care and have a good weekend.